It sits along much of the south end of Toronto's downtown, a decades-old elevated expressway that in recent weeks divided not only the city from the waterfront, but citizens and city councillors as well. Joining us now with his view of the great Gardiner Expressway debate and what the outcome could deliver, here's Jeff Casello, professor at the University of Waterloo's School of Planning and the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And it's always good to have you, my fellow Red Sox fan, back here at TVO.
Great to be here.
Let's just remind everybody, there were sort of three options the Toronto City Council looked at. There was the so-called hybrid option, which was to keep the Gardiner up and move the on-ramp a little bit further away from where it was. The tear down the eastern portion and put up a grand boulevard, as they called it, or, as Rob Ford wanted, status quo.
Right.
They opted for the hybrid option.
Right.
If you had a vote, what would you have done?
None of the above. I would have taken out for the entire removal of the Gardiner from link to link. Now, the maybe closest to the Grand Boulevard would be the vision that I would have for downtown Toronto.
Take out the whole Gardiner Expressway, meaning not just that 1.7 kilometer stretch that they talked about taking down, but the whole thing?
Well, I think, you know, there's lots of reasons to think about why we have these urban expressways and what function they serve and whether or not they're still warranted in the modern city and what the value of that area could be for a city like Toronto or any city that has the urban freeway, and to think about whether or not that's the best use of our land.
When you see what Boston did, which essentially was what you're recommending here, right? Take the whole elevated expressway down, bury the whole thing,
right?
New areas for development, new areas for parkland, and so on and so forth. You know, it's great today, but it went massively over budget and massively over time.
Yeah.
And are people prepared to put up with that?
So that was 25 years and 15 billion or something all in for that project. And you know, I think that's problematic, and I think that's part of the aversion to doing massive change in urban settings, right? To try and make that kind of transformation always comes with risks in cost, risks in time, risks in inconvenience, and so on. And so I think a lot of what you saw in the voting is around city councillors was a result of fear, maybe a bit of risk aversion.
This oversimplifies it, but I'm not far off here. The people who wanted the hybrid were worried about traffic congestion and people commuting from the inner suburbs.
Right.
The people who wanted the Grand Boulevard were people more in touch with the old city of Toronto, caring more about developing downtown and so on. We are all in the same city, but whose needs ought to be paramount?
So it really is about having a vision for the city and the city as it fits into the region. So what role will downtown Toronto play for the GTHA in the next, as they say, 100 years, right? What are we trying to do? And for me, what I think what the downtown Toronto should be is it should remain a commercial district. It's become an increasingly residential district, but it should be walkable, bikeable, friendly. It should be cohesive and connected. And I think the people who see Toronto as an urban environment, who sees the downtown core serving that function, voted for the Grand Boulevard option.
Are expressways inconsistent with what you just described?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, Boston spent 15 billion. Detroit has more freeway miles now than population, I think. It's unbelievable. And so the freeway concept is a 1950s post-war concept that doesn't really resonate with contemporary planning or traffic engineering philosophy.
The mayor of Toronto said, I didn't get elected to increase anybody's commute times, even by 3 minutes, which was what the estimate was for creating the Grand Boulevard and removing that stretch of the Gardiner Expressway. As a transportation expert, what do you think of the projections that say, do this and it'll only cost you 3 minutes?
Yeah, I think, well, the mayor may not have been elected to increase anyone's travel time, but everyone's travel time is increasing. And the idea that we can continue to move throughout the GTHA simply by car is not feasible. And so I think no matter what you do with the Gardiner Expressway, we're still going to have longer commutes until we get to a system that has the options for people to bike, walk, cycle, use transit in the same quarters where we have freeways now. That's the only way you reduce congestion and the only way you make the system function better.
That's 10, 20 years down the road,
though. It certainly is, yeah. But I think for a city like Toronto, we have to get, Steve, onto the global agenda, no pun intended. We have to get consistent with our global peers. Look at what London has done. Look at what Singapore has done. I heard this week that Beijing has built 1,000 kilometers of metro in the last 10 years. 1,000 kilometers of metro. Of subway, yes. And so, of course, they had Olympics and they had other funding, and it's a different, social model and so on. But if we want to remain economically competitive, this stagnation that we're in and this repeating of the status quo and the hybrid option, to be frank, is just keeping us on that same pace. We have to do something about congestion. It's the issue that is really suppressing the global economic competitiveness of the city.
Yeah, but I did hear city councilors say things like, okay, fine, you want to take down the Gardiner Expressway. All the people who now, and admittedly there weren't very many, I think there was a tiny percentage of people who used that chunk of the Gardiner Expressway to commute. But the fear was all of those people are going to then go into local neighborhoods and find those sort of side streets to make their commute on, which would infuriate the people who live there and the councillors who represent them.
Sure.
What do you do about that?
So whenever you make a change of this magnitude, it has to come with an alternative. And ideally, the alternative gets built before the change comes. So you can't tell people who have made, firms have made decisions to locate where they are. Companies have opened up businesses, shops, restaurants. People have chosen where to live and work and play based on the presence of the Gardiner Expressway. And you can't take that away in 1 or 2 years and say that's going to go away. You've got to give a 10-year window to have that happen. And in that 10-year window, you should be thinking about what are the viable alternatives for that. So is it a transit line in that same corridor? Is it a bus rapid transit line? How are we going to accommodate those trips? And so if you were to take it down and provide nothing else, probably the local roads would become the alternative, and it would be problematic. But I don't think any good engineer or planner would make that decision. They would decide what are going to be the alternatives before we decide to take the Gardiner Expressway down.
There's a dirty word in all of this that doesn't come up, and that word is tolls.
Yes.
Once upon a time, they were on the table as an option to either fund new highways or new public transit developments, etc. No one says that anymore. Where is the place for tolls in this debate?
So we need a way to fund our transportation infrastructure. The most direct way to fund our transportation infrastructure is to have those who are consuming it pay for it. And I think there's one other key message that always gets lost in this discussion. If I want to drive on the Gardiner at 3:30 in the morning, there's very few other people who want to do that, right? And so the cost of driving on the Gardiner at that time is very low. But if I want to get on the Gardiner at 8 a.m. or at 5 p.m., everybody wants to be there at the same time. And just like any other good that we sell, we change the price of that good depending on how many people want it. And so the toll should be set such that it sends economic signals for people who have choices to travel when there is opportunities to do so without becoming congested. There's a lot of cities in the world where the price to enter a roadway changes as a function of the number of people on the road. And that's acceptable to people when there are viable alternatives. So we go back to the same question. First, build the alternative, introduce tolls, gather up some revenue. The revenues can pay for whatever public investment you want to put into place prior to the introduction of tolls.
But if I hear you right, you've got to have that infrastructure in place before you introduce tolls.
But
so you can't do tolls now.
I would not suggest tolls right away, but I would suggest that if we want to spend whatever it is, $1, $2, $5, $10 billion to recreate the downtown of Toronto, and we want to provide transit alternatives in that corridor, if it costs us $10 billion in public funds to do it now, but we're going to toll parallel freeways, we're going to toll 401, we're going to toll 427, what that gives us is a guaranteed revenue source to pay back the debt that the province has taken on to build that massive infrastructure.
I know you are a transportation and not political science expert.
Right.
But tolls have been a political non-starter for years and years because politicians believe they can't sell them to the public, particularly on roads like the 401 that they have been traveling on, quote unquote, for free for 60 years. What do you do about that?
So I think that the key thing is really around the alternative generation. You have to give people, again, so this is what, if I were...
Waving a magic wand.
Yes, here I am. Now I am Minister of Transportation. If I were that person, I would say, look, in 10 years, we're going to toll the 401. So make your changes now. We're going to, if you need to find a new place to live, the government will support a transition fee for you through tax rebates, however that is. If you need to relocate your business, again, the government will help with that. But in 10 years, we're going to toll the 401.
How can a government that's elected for 4 years make a promise that's not going to kick in for 10?
Okay, so the wand is magic, right? So I can say whatever I wish. But maybe 4 years, the political horizon is the one that you want. And so you say that in 4 years. It's a shorter term, and the transitions would have to be quicker. But you have to give a little bit of advance notice. And then you let people transition, you build the alternative, you begin to collect the tolls. And there's one other thing about the tolls that people hate, and it's a lack of transparency. They hate to pay that money and not see where that money goes. So every time someone goes through the tolls on the 401, 401, we should have a web page where you can go and watch the dollar value of the fund that's generated by the 401 come up.
Or even a sign on the highway.
Exactly. And then when we need the money, we go and we take that out and we watch a $10 billion deduction happen, and away we go. I mean, it's just like people manage their bank accounts. It's in an era where we can do this.
Would you put photo radar back on the highways?
I think we do need to control the way people travel because, well, on the way here today, there are people going 145 kilometers an hour weaving between lanes on the 401. And that's, there's no shortage of fatalities and tragedies on the 401. And this is, not to be harsh, but it's not only a safety issue, but it can be a revenue generating opportunity if we actually monitor the way people travel.
It feels as if there's nothing that can be done, save and except for when these new transit systems are in place, which is another decade away,
right,
to make traffic move better. Is there anything that can be done before all this public transit is finished?
Sure. Yeah, and the city is already working on these things. In many cities, there's what we call smart infrastructure. So traffic signals don't operate in isolation. Everyone down the arterial knows what's happening at the one before. And so if you are trying to move people east-west, you synchronize the lights so that the movement on the east-west arterials is easy to accomplish. It works better.
Can you do that and be in sync, east-west, and north-south at the same time?
You need to know, typically you need to know what the dominant movement is. So
okay.
If it is north-south, then you synchronize for that. If it's east-west, you synchronize for that.
But I think you can't do both, probably.
No, but I think you can let people know which corridors are synchronized. In fact, drivers find that out for themselves. They know that if they go up Yonge Street, the travel time is faster than if they go up Spadina because the signals are synchronized. It's just something that people learn. So there are things we can do in the short term, there's no question. I mean, it's as easy as telling people what the traffic information is in real time. There's a radio station in town that plays a lot of, that in between their traffic updates have some other programming, right? But they're really a traffic update station. But they tell you the situation, but they never tell you alternatives. They never say the best option is this or that. And so even that information can be helpful to improve the situation without a massive infrastructure investment.
Again, going back to you having this magic wand, if you did want to get rid of the entire Gardiner Expressway and presumably embark on what would probably be a 2-decade-long quest to replace it, what's a reasonable time frame within which to tell people, here's what we're going to do?
Yeah, I think, again, it's something in the shortest window, I would say 3 to 5 years. Longer term, if you had the flexibility, you would want to do it over a decade. And but that's, people make life choices all the time, where to buy a house, whether to buy a second car, changing jobs. And a normal window for that is 3 to 5 to 7 years. I think those are reasonable time frames.
Do you sense any appetite among the population to do something that big?
The question we have to ask ourselves is, does Toronto want to transform its downtown and transform its downtown to be a globally economically competitive city?
Based on the vote we saw earlier this week, the answer seems to be no.
Well, the answer was 50-50, right?
Well, it was 24-21.
Okay,
it's not
so,
quite 50-50, but it's close.
Yeah, it is close. And I think if you had asked that question 3 years ago, Steve, the answer, the vote would have been significantly different, with many fewer in support of the idea. And so I think the idea that traffic congestion we're able to tolerate what we have now is, I think people are moving past that. They're ready for change. I've done my own research. I've asked people, how much would you be willing to pay to travel on the 401 in an uncongested condition? And people, regardless of age, income, race, color, creed, have all said, I'm willing to pay for this. Something, provided that there is an alternative in place that will, or I either get guaranteed quality of service, so I won't fall below 50 kilometers per hour or 60 kilometers per hour, or there's an alternative in place.
I'm not sure it's ever going to happen because there will be legal challenges, and there are numerous further opportunities for City Council to vote on this and potentially change its mind. I mean, this is something that's not going to happen for 10 years, so there'll be 2 different councils by the time this gets to the finish line. But bottom line, do you think Toronto screwed up by opting for the hybrid?
Well, as you say, it's not the end-all decision. I mean, I think that very well could revisit this decision in a year or 2, and there's got to be a year or 2 of planning, I think, before this actually gets in place.
Environmental assessments and so on.
Of course, yeah. So I mean, I strongly encourage those who are thinking a lot about this to be part of that dialogue, particularly through the environmental assessment process. I know I'll contribute to something formally, and hopefully it'll be heard about what the best option is. One other thing I think the city has to think about is the developable land that they're going to open up in the absence of that. And there's an enormous opportunity there to collect some of the cost of the Gardiner. I mean, if you impose a 1% additional property tax on properties that become available there over the next 20 years, to the buyer, it's no impact, right?
Big revenue windfall.
But it's a huge revenue windfall.
Gotcha. Jeff, always good to have you here at TVO. Thanks so much.
Great to be here, Steve.
Jeff Casello.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.